Welcome to People and Profit. I'm Kate Moody. Coming up, Russia is facing a raft of financial sanctions after it invaded Ukraine, but it spent years building up its economy to protect against such measures. We take a look at Vladimir Putin's fortress economy. Plus, how the conflict could impact already struggling global supply chains, from oil and gas to wheat and corn, palladium and titanium. Supplies of all sorts of commodities stand to be disrupted. Since Russian forces invaded Ukraine on the 24th of February, the European Union, United States, and other allies have imposed unprecedented sanctions against Moscow and President Vladimir Putin. The measures include freezing the assets of Russian lenders, including the central bank, blocking some financial institutions from the SWIFT messaging system, which facilitates international transactions, and banning the sale of high-tech components like semiconductors or airplane parts. But for years, since its annexation of Crimea in 2014, the Russian government has been taking preemptive steps to protect and insulate its economy from such sanctions, a strategy some analysts have dubbed Fortress Russia. Let's bring in Alistair Milne, Professor of Financial Economics at Loughborough University. Thanks for being with us today. Talk us through some of the ways in which Russia has been preparing its economy to face more international sanctions.
Well, we've got to remember that Russia has been preparing to make itself a kind of fortress economy for, I think, more than 10 years. I think the possibility of a major international confrontation has been in the planning for a decade inside the Kremlin. And we know part of that actually is not working out so well. They've built up a huge portfolio of foreign exchange reserves, but then they're having trouble accessing that. So that's one way. But actually, the most important and the one that's least remarked on is food security. Russia has doubled its grain production since 2012. Putin set a target and said, we can no longer be a grain importer. We must have to produce our own food and then export it. They're now the world's largest grain exporter. And that's critical if you've got a long-term military campaign, because the two things you need to conduct a war are energy and grain.
What do we know about how all those moves have impacted the Russian population over the last decade?
Well, it's extraordinary that they haven't kind of revolted, because there's been almost a complete cessation of economic growth. So we're used in the West to the idea that, it's not good every year, but consumption and incomes, we hope, are going to grow year by year, new technology, new products. The Russian citizens have seen very little of that in the last 7 or 8 years. Their economy has been stagnating, and it's been seeing very little innovation because everything has gone into the kind of military complex and supporting the idea of Russia as an independent state that doesn't depend economically on the rest of the world.
Now, there's been a lot of focus on this decision to cut many Russian banks off of the SWIFT messaging system. It makes it more complicated, but not impossible for them to do international transactions. How significant do you think that move was, and how effective do you think it will be?
Well, I think it's been very important symbolically because, it's an international arrangement. So the fact that we're able to agree across the Western countries, let's take this move. But it's important to me primarily as a symbol. I think in reality, there's quite a few workarounds. There are other systems. There's one known as SPFS, which is actually run by the Central Bank of Russia. It's mostly for the Eurasian countries, those Kurdistan, Kazakhstan, Armenia, those sort of places. But other banks can plug, it's essentially the same technology as SWIFT. It's the same standards. So other banks around the world could easily plug into that or get someone to plug them in if they wanted. So on its own, throwing out a SWIFT makes very little difference.
So why has there been so much pressure on leaders to do that?
Well, I regret to say, I think it's our own propaganda war. So our leaders, who frankly are a little bit scared of Putin, think we must have something which shows we're strong, something we can send around the world to say we're doing things. SWIFT. Well, we know it doesn't really do that much, but it sounds fantastic. So let's tell our citizens that we're doing wonderful things. So I regret that they did that. I don't think SWIFT themselves wanted to be politicized in this way. I think they should have been more honest and said, we're going to impose real sanctions, but they're going to hurt us as well as the Russians.
In your view, what are the most effective sanctions that have been announced so far?
the central bank, the freeze on central bank assets has certainly made a big difference. I mean, for two reasons, I think. Firstly, it's put the Russian financial markets into free fall. So that's been quite a shock. But remember, Russia doesn't depend on financial markets in the same way that we in the West do. They can still run their military machine. I think it was a bit naive when one of the leading politicians said, we're going to cut off the sources of war finance. But Russia doesn't need the financial markets or the world financial system to finance war. It will affect Russian industry, of course. They'll be badly hit. But the central bank measure has been effective. But the problem really here is the longer term. If they succeed in crushing Ukraine, and eventually it's hard to see a different outcome. If eventually they succeed in crushing Ukraine, then the kind of reality is we're going to sort of say, oh, well, we didn't want this to happen. We did what we could to stop it, but we failed to stop it. And what's the point of the sanctions anymore? So then they'll be gradually wound down. And, the Russia economy will be permanently weakened. But from Putin's perspective, it will still be a victory.
Do you think economic sanctions can really be effective if they don't go after Russia's energy sector?
The energy sector is important, but again, to wage war, they don't need foreign exchange in, say, the next 6 months or so. I mean, there will come a point where they need certain kind of spare parts, but it's probably more important just to ban the export of those spare parts. So they're just hanging on until we cut off the energy.
So do you think the idea of sanctioning Moscow in this crisis is a lost cause?
We're just not doing it the right way. The problem is it's what are known as executive sanctions. So it's President Biden, who's well-meaning and in many ways very effective. I quite liked, is it Bruno Le Maire, the French minister? I think he used the right words, total war. I don't think we should hold back from that. But what does total war consist of? I think it requires parliamentary legislative action across all the parliaments of the Western world, saying that we prohibit, I would suggest for the next 20 years, all financial and economic transactions with Russia. And the 20 years is important because Putin himself is a lawyer. I think that will hit him hard to realize, gosh, my legacy is not the great victory of Russia. My legacy is 20 years completely in the wilderness. But it needs to be legislation because our politicians, bless them, are very weak. That's the nature of democracy. They appeal to voters, so therefore they're weak. So we have to use Parliament instead, not our politicians. And Parliament has to pass 20 years of sanctions so that Russia knows it has no hope.
Alistair Milne, thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Well, Russia is known as a major oil and gas exporter, but it also has huge reserves of other natural resources which stand to be disrupted. Russia produces more than 40% of the world's palladium, a key component in electronics. It's also a top supplier of platinum, gold, nickel, and aluminum. Together with Ukraine, it accounts for a quarter of global wheat exports and a fifth of corn sales. That means the spiraling conflict and ensuing sanctions could throw off supply chains for industries around the world. Chris Beecham, Chief Market Analyst at IG, joins us now. Chris, we've already seen oil and gas prices soar as this crisis escalated. How much disruption do you foresee for global energy supplies?
The energy supply element, I think, is crucial at this point. The sanctions proceeded without much reference to energy, but it's clear from Biden's speech, the State of the Union speech, that really I think we can expect further sanctions to be imposed that will really hit the global energy supply. OPEC has decided not to increase its output for the time being, but I think that is almost inevitable and have to respond in some way to the likelihood that you'll see disruptions to energy supplies across Europe. And that, of course, has a major impact on the economies there and feeds into the broader debate about whether markets are braced for, whether stock markets certainly are braced for further falls. Commodity prices certainly look set for further gains.
Now, beyond energy, Russia does also produce a lot of raw materials, metals in particular. So these already strained supply chains could face still more problems.
Yes, exactly. I think we'll see further reductions of exports from Russia. That puts pressure on businesses across the globe, and again feeds into the debate about inflation. So we should expect to see those prices rise, even as companies look to find alternative sources. Of course, that takes time. You've got to transport them. Everything seems to threaten the more significant hit to global supply chains. And that was also a big theme of last year, and how the global economy was having to cope with those becoming strained. And now they're being strained towards breaking point and probably beyond that as well.
When it comes to agriculture, we know that certain emerging markets are particularly dependent on wheat, corn, seed oils that come from both Russia and Ukraine. How is this going to affect them?
Well, again, we're looking at a major hit to economic growth there, of course, quite apart from the hit to food supplies, and this will sort of feed through into economic performance. So we can expect this to be another major problem that will redound not just to emerging markets, but to developed ones as well. The global economy is interconnected in a way that hasn't been ever in history. And I think you're seeing these disruptions across so many commodities, and especially in agricultural commodities, the basic essentials of life, rising in price and being disrupted in supply. It's a kind of almost perfect storm, I think, for these emerging markets, especially when you're also facing the likelihood of the Fed raising rates, even if they do so at a slower tempo than had been expected back in January.
Are there any markets or exporters that could actually wind up benefiting from this conflict?
Well, all those countries that will find themselves suddenly in high demand with they produce those metals. So you're looking at, again, Australia, if it can meet demand, but a host of African countries producing these metals will be key ones to look out for. And of course, they will see increased demand, and that should boost their performance to an extent. Whether that's enough to outweigh the disruptions that we've just talked about, of course, remains to be seen. But certainly, I think that other emerging markets will be potential winners from this if they see that demand begin to feed through to their economies, and the output they'll have to respond by increasing that output in order to meet those increased needs from different companies.
Chris Beecham, thanks so much for joining us on People and Profit. Well, that's all for this week, but you can find this and all our previous programs on our website and as a podcast wherever you usually listen. You can also get in touch with your comments and questions on social media. Until next time, thanks for watching.
They observe. They contact us. They report, film, photograph. They are the voice of the voiceless. Your eyes in the far-flung reaches of the world. The Observers, a network of 5,000 committed citizens working with France 24.
One of our observers in Côte d'Ivoire, Gaspard.
Amateur footage and testimonials checked by our journalists and broadcast weekly on The Observers, on France 24 and observers.france24.com.